In Havenbrook, a small town with an untouched rhythm, Harold Mercer, an old man with a cane, quietly becomes part of the landscape. Every morning he arrives at the Red Fern Cafe for his black coffee, but no one knows his story until Rachel Flynn, a former reporter turned baker, notices his silence and mysterious presence. When General Douglas Keene recognizes Harold as a war hero, the town is shaken by the realization of who they've been ignoring. What follows is a quiet, profound revelation of Harold's bravery and the power of seeing those who live unnoticed, but with incredible strength. If this heartfelt story of quiet strength moved you, we invite you to show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Join us for more powerful tales that celebrate the unsung heroes in our communities. Your voice matters. Share this story, and let's keep honoring the silent warriors who shape our world. Stay kind, stay curious, and never forget the quiet ones. The sound of laughter rang out from the crowd, someone chuckling loudly enough to be heard over the buzz of conversation. It was dismissive, like the flick of a hand. The old man didn't flinch. He kept walking, each tap of his cane on the pavement ringing out in a steady rhythm, as methodical as the ticking of a clock. Step, tap, step, tap. The crowd continued cheering, the noise swelling, until the man with the cane stepped forward. He wasn't part of the show. He hadn't asked for applause, but when the general saw him, everything went quiet. Captain Mercer. A hush fell over the square, thick and heavy, like the silence just before a storm breaks. Then, like a wave crashing on the shore, the cheers and gasps erupted, people saluting as they realized who they had just mocked. The applause was deafening, the loudest Havenbrook had ever known. Havenbrook wasn't a place you'd find on most maps. If you blinked on the county road, you might miss the crooked wooden sign half hidden by an overgrown hedge. Reading simply, "Welcome to Havenbrook, founded 1864. And truth be told, most folks around there didn't mind that at all. It was the kind of town where autumn didn't need a tourist brochure. The maple trees painted the main street in shades of amber and gold, like a photograph come to life, and the air always carried the scent of wood smoke and riverstone. There was a church that still rang its bell by hand, a barber who worked only Tuesdays and Fridays, and a radio station that played more static than music. Nestled on the corner of Oak and Main sat the Red Fern Cafe. Its red awning had faded after years of sun and snow, like it had worn the years like an old coat. Inside, the wallpaper curled at the edges, peeling like the pages of a forgotten book, and an old ceiling fan turned lazily above the checkered tables. But the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, and the biscuits, legendary enough to bring anyone back to town, even if they'd left years ago. Rachel Flynn stood behind the counter most mornings, apron dusted with flour, short auburn hair tucked behind one ear, sleeves rolled high as she poured coffee with practiced ease. She hadn't always been the one behind the counter. Not too long ago, she had been the one asking tough questions in courtroom hallways and on radio airwaves in the city. But burnout is a quiet fire. It's the kind of thing that creeps up on you until you're scorched. And when that happened, Rachel packed up her life and drove, only stopping when the traffic faded. That road led her to Havenbrook. She didn't talk much about her old life, not even to Missy, the cafe's sharp-tongued waitress, who had worked there since before Rachel was born. Missy had eyes like a hawk and a mouth like a sailor's widow, quick with a refill and quicker with a sharp comeback. Her banter with old Nate, a former shop teacher who now practically lived at the cafe, was half the entertainment. "Missy, this coffee's so strong, I think I just grew a third eyebrow," Nate muttered one morning, peering into his mug. "That's your conscience catching up with you," she replied, not even looking up, pouring him another half cup. The regulars chuckled softly. Humor in Havenbrook came slow and dry, like rain after a long drought. But even in a town where nothing much ever changed, everyone noticed Harold Mercer. He always arrived at the same time, 7:42 a.m. on the dot. Rain or shine, coat buttoned to the top, his cane tapping out a slow, deliberate rhythm as he made his way to the back booth by the window. The cane had seen better days. Its surface was scarred and worn, the rubber tip about to split. But what always caught Rachel's attention wasn't the cane. It was how still he was once he sat down. He seemed frozen, like a photograph that refused to fade. He never ordered, just sat quietly, and Missy would bring him a black coffee. No sugar, no cream, no words. He'd place a few bills on the edge of the table, always exact, always cash, and then he'd stare out the window at the town square as if waiting for something that never arrived. Some folks thought he was just a drifter who'd gotten stuck in Havenbrook, too proud to leave, too quiet to explain. Others whispered, mostly after their third refill, that he was ex-military, a man who had seen too much and said too little. But no one ever asked, not even Nate, who had an opinion on everything, from soup recipes to the U.S. Constitution. Rachel had tried once, just a simple nod, a polite hello. He met her eyes, blue, sharp like winter water, but said nothing. That had been enough. Since then, she just watched, observed. Old habits die hard, and her instincts as a former journalist were always alert. Harold Mercer was the kind of man her instincts told her to watch. One morning, as November crept in and frost clung stubbornly to the window panes, Rachel noticed something odd. As Harold sat down, he placed something beside his coffee, a folded napkin, creased and pressed into the shape of a perfect five-pointed star. He left it behind when he rose. Rachel picked it up gently, examining the folds. They weren't random. They were intentional, precise. That night, for the first time in months, she wrote in her notebook, "There's something about the way he sits, like he's holding up a story too heavy for words. Something in the rhythm of that cane. Something I've seen before in courtrooms, in war veterans, in mothers waiting outside hospital rooms." Harold Mercer had become part of Havenbrook, though no one had ever invited him in. Yet there he was, every morning. Same table, same coffee, the same air of mystery that seemed to surround him. A story written in the way he carried himself. Rachel Flynn, who had grown used to his presence, was determined to uncover it, to read between the lines of his quiet routine. Every town has its rhythm, and in Havenbrook, it wasn't the toll of the church bell or the rumble of the morning freight train that marked the time. It was the sound of Harold Mercer's cane tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Without fail, at precisely 7:42 a.m., he appeared at the door of the Red Fern Cafe. Rachel had grown accustomed to the sequence, the soft creak of the door, the rush of cold air that followed him in, and then the pause. There was always a moment where Harold seemed to take in the room without speaking, his eyes rarely moving. He walked slowly, deliberately, not from frailty, but as if each step held significance, as if every movement carried weight in memory. His cane, made of wood with a worn leather grip, tapped 3 times before he reached his usual spot, the corner booth with the best view of the square. That booth, always the same, always facing the same direction. Missy, the waitress, didn't ask for his order anymore. A cup of black coffee appeared for him, delivered without a word. Harold would nod, just a barely perceptible gesture, and then his gaze would drift outside, lost in a landscape that no one else could see. Rachel, trying to be discreet, found herself watching him from behind the bakery case. He never fidgeted, never checked his phone, never unfolded a newspaper. His hands rested in front of him, one occasionally adjusting his cup, the other resting gently on the edge of the table. His fingers, slightly bent from age or injury, gave him a quiet dignity. Rachel noticed the small things, how he always smoothed his napkin before placing it under his cup. How though he never used it, he would fold his sugar packet into a neat triangle, pressing it flat with his thumb. Sometimes he would take something from his coat, perhaps a small square of paper or a handkerchief. Once, he even took out a silver coin, turning it over in his palm for 10 solid minutes before tucking it away again, as though it had said everything he needed. The rest of the cafe hummed with its usual small-town energy. Old Nate grumbled about taxes and the weather, claiming they were both part of the same government conspiracy. Missy, with her endless supply of sass, refilled cups with an arched brow. Truck drivers came through for a quick breakfast, and local kids ran in with library books, their hands sticky with syrup. The bell above the door never stayed quiet for long. But Harold Mercer, he was an island in the middle of it all, silent, undisturbed. Then, one morning, Benji arrived. A scrappy 9-year-old with skinned knees and a mop of messy brown hair. Benji was a regular whenever school was out. His mother worked the overnight shift at the hospital, and the cafe had unofficially become his morning stop before school. Rachel had set up a little corner for him, stocked with crayons, paper, and the occasional blueberry muffin when tips were good. That morning, Benji plopped into his seat with dramatic flair, a sleepy grin on his face. He scanned the room and, as usual, his eyes landed on Harold. "Why does he always sit there?" Benji asked, leaning across the counter. Rachel shrugged quietly. "That's his spot." Benji squinted, as if trying to make sense of the puzzle before him. "He looks like a statue, like he's guarding something." Rachel blinked, surprised by his insight. "That's not far off," she murmured, though she said no more. Benji didn't wait for an explanation. He grabbed a crayon and began sketching, his tongue poking out from the corner of his mouth in deep concentration. Within 10 minutes, he held up his picture, a rough but unmistakable drawing of Harold Mercer sitting in his booth, cane propped beside him, a steaming coffee cup in hand. Rachel stifled a smile. "Oh, that's really good, Benji." "I'm going to give it to him," Benji declared. Before Rachel could stop him, Benji hopped down from his seat, picture in hand, and marched straight to the back booth. Harold looked up at him, and for a moment his face remained unchanged. Then his eyes fell on the drawing. There was no smile, no words spoken, but his gaze lingered on the paper longer than anything else in the cafe had ever held him. Benji hesitated, unsure. "You can keep it if you want," he offered quietly. Harold's fingers moved with unexpected gentleness as he took the paper. He nodded once, a short and almost imperceptible motion, before tapping the table twice. Benji beamed and dashed back to his corner. From behind the counter, Rachel watched in silence, awe slowly settling in her chest. For the first time in months, Harold Mercer seemed to be truly present, as if someone had reached through his armor, knocked gently, and reminded him that the world still saw him. He didn't leave the drawing on the table. Instead, he folded it carefully, too carefully for something he didn't care about, and tucked it into the pocket of his coat. The next morning, Rachel found a napkin folded into the exact same shape as Benji's drawing, left quietly on the counter. It was a silent thank you, felt more than spoken. And from that day on, every time Benji came in, Harold Mercer's eyes would follow him. For just a moment longer than usual, Rachel watched the old man. Something about him that day felt different. She could feel it in her bones. This wasn't just a man with a cane. It wasn't just an ordinary routine. The napkin stars continued to appear, a quiet mystery between them. Each morning, Rachel would find one, perfectly folded, always left in silence. It became their unspoken language. Harold never uttered a word of thanks, but the mystery deepened inside Rachel, a curiosity gnawing at her. There was something in the way Harold moved, too careful, too measured, the same posture she'd seen in combat veterans testifying in hearings when she was a reporter. The stillness in his body, the scanning eyes, the edge of discipline that never fully retired. Rachel recognized it. There was a story there, and she needed to uncover it. One foggy Thursday, unable to resist any longer, she decided to dig deeper. After the breakfast rush had passed, she pulled out the town archives binder Missy kept behind the counter. Old menus, forgotten newspaper clippings, cafe trivia. But it was the obituaries and service records that caught her attention. She flipped through them. No Harold Mercer, not in the war memorials, not in the town's birth records, not even in the church registry. A ghost, no trace of him anywhere. That night after the cafe had closed, Rachel sat down with her laptop, diving into the kind of investigative work she hadn't done in years. Her fingers typed in Harold Mercer, Havenbrook, but nothing appeared. No service records, no veteran registrations, no articles. The silence screamed louder than any denial. It was a hole, a missing thread. Harold Mercer didn't exist in the town's records, or at least not the ones Rachel could access. The next day, as she walked through the town square, she passed Mr. Lennox's house. He was the retired librarian who knew every corner of Havenbrook like the back of his hand. His house was full of books, overflowing with stories, and a cat that responded to the name Captain. Rachel knocked on his door, and it creaked open after a moment. "Miss Flynn?" Lennox asked, blinking through thick bifocals. "The smell of flowers gives you away." "I need your help with a name," Rachel said, holding her notebook. "Do you know anything about a man named Harold Mercer?" Lennox's face didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Depends on who's asking." Well, let's say a baker who used to be a reporter. He stepped aside, nodding. Then I suppose you better come in. Inside, the house smelled of old wallpaper and lemon polish. Lennox moved with slow confidence, the kind that only comes from never being rushed but always being on time. Rachel explained everything. Harold's routine, his silence, the mysterious napkin stars, the missing records. Lennox listened, no interruption. I haven't heard that name in a long time, he finally said. And when I did, it wasn't in a library book. Was he military? Oh yes, but not ordinary military, Lennox continued. Not Army, not Navy. The kind of man who answers phones that don't ring publicly. Classified? Rachel asked. Lennox nodded slowly. He used to train others, special operations from what I gathered. Back in the 80s, when I was on the Veterans Committee, there were whispers. Someone called him the Shepherd. But after 1975, his name just disappeared. It vanished. Not in any local records. Rachel frowned. So you're saying he erased himself? No, Lennox replied, his voice low. I'm saying someone helped him do it. Before Rachel left, Lennox handed her a tattered file folder. This belonged to a friend of mine who used to run the town paper. Thought you might find it interesting. Back at the bakery, after the ovens were off and the cafe dimmed, Rachel opened the folder. She felt her breath catch. There it was, a headline clipped from the Havenbrook Herald, dated July 17, 1973. Captain H. Mercer awarded medal for bravery. Rescue in Highlands saved 6. The photo was grainy and black and white, his face barely visible under a helmet, but the posture was unmistakable. Even blurred, even faded by time, she could see it. That was Harold Mercer. She read the article twice. Captain H. Mercer, age undisclosed, recognized for acts of valor following a rescue operation during a nighttime ambush in the Central Highlands. Reports say he carried multiple wounded soldiers to safety under fire and refused extraction until all personnel were accounted for. No mention of his origins, no interviews, no follow-up. Rachel's hands trembled as she placed the clipping on the counter. This man, who had quietly entered her cafe every day, folded napkins, drank his coffee, and sat in silence. No one knew who he really was. Not Missy, not Nate, not even the flag-waving veterans who met every Tuesday to swap war stories and complain about gas prices. He had never sought attention, and now Rachel understood why. The next morning, Rachel carefully placed the newspaper clipping into an envelope and tucked it under Harold's coffee cup. He didn't react when he saw it, just slid the envelope into his coat pocket with that same silent nod. But when he left, something was different. A new napkin star sat on the counter, folded tighter than the others. Beneath it, in sharp block letters, "You ask the right questions." Rachel stared at it, her heart pounding. She had begun something now. The truth was unraveling. Rachel stood in the Red Fern Cafe, her hands wrapped around a cold coffee cup, watching the town square through the window. The morning was quiet, the streets of Havenbrook shimmering faintly with dew, a soft mist curling around the sidewalks like an old soldier waking from a long sleep. American flags hung from every lamppost, gently waving in the breeze. Folding chairs lined the square, many already filled by elderly locals, their faces worn with years of memory and time. The square hummed with quiet anticipation. The brass band was tuning their instruments near the gazebo. Scouts were handing out miniature flags, while children, jittery in thick coats, practiced their salutes under the watchful eyes of their teachers. Rachel's eyes scanned the crowd. She had checked the corner booth twice. Harold Mercer hadn't come in. No coffee, no napkin star, not even a glance. Missy hadn't said anything, but the fact that she had left Harold's usual cup by the machine was enough to speak volumes. Rachel adjusted her scarf and stepped outside, joining the townspeople lining the sidewalks. She continued to search, her heart heavy with uncertainty. By 10 o'clock, the parade began. The MC, a short man with a booming voice, announced the start. A rusted green Jeep rolled forward, driven by a World War II veteran, his hat too large for his head. Applause rippled through the crowd. Rachel stood near Benji, who held his school's banner with both hands, lips pressed tight in concentration. He glanced up at her and whispered, "Is he coming?" "I don't know," Rachel replied, her voice tight, and for the first time, she truly didn't. The parade continued, local students marching with uneven rhythm but full hearts. The town applauded, but Rachel's mind drifted. She thought of the napkins, of Harold's silence, of the envelope she had left him with that 1973 newspaper clipping. She thought of the look in his eyes the day he took it, a silent recognition, not of her, but of time catching up. Then, just as the marching band began their rendition of God Bless America, she saw him. Harold stood beneath the old elm tree at the far end of the square. He wore the same dark overcoat, the same flat cap, and beside him his cane rested like an old comrade. He didn't push through the crowd or wave at anyone. He simply watched, calm, motionless, and somehow commanding despite saying nothing. Rachel's breath caught, and someone else noticed too. From the steps of the gazebo, General Douglas Keene, a retired officer visiting from the Capitol, squinted toward the tree. He had his speech in hand, but he didn't read it. He straightened, his posture shifting, his mouth opening slowly. "Captain Mercer," he said, not into the mic, but aloud, his voice clear and unmistakable. The entire square froze. The air shifted, the music faltered. The drummers paused mid-beat. Benji turned, eyes wide. Someone in the crowd whispered, "What did he say? Did he say Mercer?" The silence grew deep and reverent. Dozens of veterans turned in unison toward the elm tree. A few stood slowly, others removed their hats. Even the flag stopped waving. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Harold remained motionless, acknowledging General Keene's gaze with the slightest nod. Rachel felt her heart skip a beat. Keene stepped down from the gazebo, crossing the path between the rows of chairs slowly, as if he were approaching sacred ground. His medals caught the sunlight, flashing like old memories. When he reached Harold, he stopped short. "Sir," Keene's voice was thick now. "You saved 6 of us that night, 1972, near Doto. You dragged me from a ditch after I was hit. I never saw you again. Never forgot." Harold met his gaze, then raised his right hand in a sharp, exact salute. General Keene returned it, equally sharp. No ceremony, no speeches, just 2 men, one carrying decades of silence, the other the weight of finally speaking. And then the applause started. It began at the back, 1 person, then 2, then 10, and suddenly the whole town was on its feet, clapping, cheering, crying. Veterans who had once dismissed him now stood with trembling hands and damp eyes. Children raised their flags higher. The brass band struck up the anthem again, louder, faster. Rachel's palms stung from clapping so hard. She turned to Benji, who had dropped his banner and was waving both arms. A wide smile stretched across his face. The sound rolled across the square like thunder, like a salute finally being heard. For a brief moment, Rachel thought Harold might say something, a word, a gesture, but he didn't. He lowered his hand, gave one last look at the crowd, and turned, walking away. No curtain call, no attention. Just the familiar tap, tap, tap of his cane fading into the crowd. Rachel's heart tightened, but not from sadness. It was something deeper, something she couldn't put into words. It was the weight of history, the acknowledgement of a life lived in silence, and the understanding that sometimes the most powerful moments are the ones when nothing is said at all. The day Harold Mercer stood among them in silence marked a turning point, not in him, but in all of them. They hadn't noticed it at first, but something had changed, something they couldn't ignore any longer. That day, none of them would forget the man who had quietly existed among them, a man whose presence had gone unnoticed for so long. But now they had finally seen him. By the next morning, Harold was gone. The usual spot he occupied at the Red Fern Cafe was empty, a vacant booth where he'd once sat day after day, nursing a steaming cup of black coffee, the crease of a napkin carefully folded beside him, the rhythmic tapping of his cane against the linoleum floor like clockwork. Now it was silent. Rachel stood by the counter, arms crossed tightly, her gaze fixed on the empty chair where he had always chosen to sit. The sun filtered through the windows, dust motes dancing lazily in the beam of light, but the warmth of the day failed to reach her. She felt cold, detached from the world around her. Missy, always the one to speak first, murmured the words that no one had yet dared to voice. "He left, didn't he?" The question didn't need an answer. Rachel nodded in silence. No goodbye, no note, no star-shaped napkin, just the absence of something that had once been so ordinary, now imbued with a meaning so much deeper than anyone had anticipated. The town had been buzzing since the parade. The moment General Keene had stepped off the stage and, in front of the gathered crowd, called him Captain Mercer, it had sent shockwaves through Havenbrook. The words, Captain Mercer, had broken through the town's quiet reverence for Harold. By evening, folks who once barely acknowledged him were now quoting his name with a new kind of respect. Men who had served in less well-known wars spoke of him as a legend. Young parents told their children, "You saw a real hero today." Yet despite the wave of recognition, Harold had slipped away quietly, as though he had never been there at all. Days passed, and Rachel found herself sitting on the porch steps of the bakery, an old sketch pad resting on her lap. Benji sat next to her, legs swinging, a colored pencil tucked behind his ear. He handed her a new drawing. It was of Harold, standing tall, his coat fluttering slightly in the breeze, his cane grounded beside him. The backdrop was the war memorial, its folding chairs already stacked away. A small American flag fluttered behind him, but in the image, Harold stood alone, proud, resolute, just as Benji had always seen him. The drawing didn't evoke sadness, but a sense of permanence. Rachel stared at it for a long time, unable to speak for a while. Finally, she whispered, "Do you think he knew we'd remember him?" Benji shrugged, his small shoulders rising and falling. "I think he hoped we'd see him. That's why I drew him into the first place." Rachel smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "You saw him before the rest of us did." Weeks passed and then months. Snow began to dust the eaves of the cafe. The fall leaves had all scattered, and the winter wind carried a stillness through Havenbrook's narrow streets. Rachel continued her routine, baking in the early mornings, wiping down counters at night. But something had shifted, something intangible, yet undeniable. Now people asked about Harold. Travelers who came into the cafe curious about the town's history would stop at his old booth. "Is this where the man with the cane used to sit?" they'd ask, and Rachel would give them the answer that felt right. "Yes," she'd say, smiling slightly. "Would you like to sit there?" One afternoon, Rachel framed one of Benji's drawings and hung it above Harold's old booth. Beneath the framed drawing, she placed a small plaque, hand-lettered in gold ink. "The quietest salute can echo forever." The booth soon became known as the Hero's Table, and people began to honor Harold's memory in their own quiet ways. Months later, when Rachel opened her new bakery, the Warmth Bakery, she rebuilt it from the bones of the Red Fern Cafe, but she added something very intentional. A wall dedicated to Havenbrook's quiet servants. On it were photos, sketches, names, and tributes. In the center was Harold's booth, untouched, save for a fresh cup of black coffee placed there each Veterans Day morning. That first spring after his disappearance, a woman came into the bakery with a cedar box. She appeared to be in her 80s, her white hair pinned neatly and a hawk-shaped brooch at her collar. She said little but handed Rachel the box with trembling hands. Inside was a folded flag, its metal ribbon faded, the metal smooth and cool in Rachel's palm. "I thought it belonged here more than anywhere else," the woman said quietly. Rachel wanted to ask who she was, what she knew of Harold, but something in the woman's demeanor told her not to. So instead, Rachel placed the box beneath Benji's drawing and added a brass label. "Medal of Valor, recipient unknown to most, remembered by all." Even after the woman left, the quiet tributes continued. Every few weeks, a napkin star would appear, placed carefully by no one, but found by everyone. No one ever saw who left them, but Rachel always had a feeling. Some things don't need to be explained. Some stories finish themselves, even if the hero disappears before the last chapter is written. Harold Mercer may have walked away without a word, but what he left behind spoke louder than any speech ever could. In a world of constant noise, where voices clamored for attention, his silence was a reminder of something deeply American, something profoundly human. You don't have to shout to be strong. You don't need a podium to live with honor. There are Harold Mercers all around us, veterans, quiet workers, caregivers, neighbors, people who go unnoticed not because they have nothing to say, but because they've chosen humility over recognition. They folded their pain into something quiet, something that could still be of use, and carried on. But what if we pause just for a moment to look a little deeper? What if, instead of rushing to respond, we took the time to truly understand? Would we uncover more silent heroes living right under our noses? Perhaps the question is, who are we overlooking today? Whose worth we'll only realize too late? This story isn't just about a man with a cane. It's about the unseen legacy that each of us might quietly carry. It's about the power of simply being there for others, showing kindness, and recognizing that even the quietest lives can leave ripples that change the world when others finally take the time to listen. And maybe, just maybe, Harold hasn't really left us. Maybe he's sitting in a different cafe, in a different town, waiting for someone else to see him, the way he should have been seen long ago. If this story touched you, we encourage you to reflect on it in the comments below. Have you ever crossed paths with someone like Harold Mercer? What small acts of courage have you witnessed in your own community? Who are the silent heroes in your life? We value every comment, every thought you share. If you believe more people should hear stories like Harold's, please like this video, share it with someone who could benefit from hearing it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that highlight the strength that often goes unnoticed. A special thanks to our senior viewers, veterans, and lifelong learners who dedicate their time to being part of our community. Your wisdom, your perspective, and your stories deserve to be heard. Until next time, let's stay kind, stay curious, and never overlook the quiet ones.